The Mississippi sun beat down mercilessly on Magnolia Grove Plantation in the summer of 1823, its rays creating a shimmering haze that rose from the cotton fields like the breath of hell itself. The air hung thick with humidity and the acrid smell of sweat, tobacco, and something darker, the scent of broken spirits and crushed dreams that seemed to permeate every inch of the sprawling estate. Harriet Green stood barely 3 feet tall among the other slaves gathered in the main courtyard, her small frame dwarfed by the towering oak trees that had witnessed decades of human suffering. At 19 years old, she possessed the weathered hands of someone twice her age, each callous a testament to the brutal labor that defined her existence. Her dark eyes, however, burned with an intelligence that her captors had failed to extinguish, though they had certainly tried. "Look at what we got here," sneered Jeremiah Blackwood, the plantation's overseer, as he approached the morning assembly. His boots clicked against the worn cobblestones with the rhythm of a death march. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks and a face scarred by years of violence, Blackwood cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the light around him. Little Harriet thinks she can keep up with the real workers today. The other slaves kept their eyes fixed on the ground, knowing that any sign of sympathy or defiance would earn them a taste of Blackwood's whip. The leather weapon hung from his belt like a coiled serpent, its presence a constant reminder of the thin line between obedience and agony. Harriet's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had learned long ago that words were weapons she couldn't afford to use, not yet. Instead, she focused on the weight of the small knife hidden in the folds of her tattered dress, a blade she had carefully sharpened on the grinding stone behind the slave quarters when the moon was dark and the world was asleep. "You know what your problem is, little girl," Blackwood continued, circling her like a predator stalking wounded prey. "You think that because Master Whitmore keeps you around for his amusement, you're special. But you ain't nothing but a curiosity, a freak show for when he has guests who want to see something unusual." The word dripped from his lips like poison, and Harriet felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her chest. She had endured 19 years of being treated as less than human, but the way Blackwood spoke to her, as if she were some exotic animal in a traveling circus, cut deeper than any physical wound. Master Edmund Whitmore emerged from the grand plantation house, his white linen suit pristine despite the oppressive heat. A man in his 50s with graying temples and cold blue eyes, he surveyed his property with the detached interest of someone examining livestock. His gaze lingered on Harriet for a moment, and she saw something flicker across his features, not kindness, but a calculating assessment of her value. "Blackwood," Whitmore called out, his voice carrying the authority of generations of wealth built on human bondage. "I trust you'll ensure maximum productivity today. The cotton won't pick itself, and we have quotas to meet." "Yes, sir, Master Whitmore," Blackwood replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of false respect. "Every last one of these slaves will earn their keep, I guarantee it." "Indeed." As the slaves dispersed to their assigned tasks, Harriet felt Blackwood's hand clamp down on her shoulder with crushing force. His fingers dug into her flesh like iron claws, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath, even in the early morning air. "Not so fast, little one," he whispered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You and I have some unfinished business from last night." The memory of the previous evening flooded back with sickening clarity. Harriet had been returning from the well when Blackwood cornered her behind the smokehouse, his intentions clear in his bloodshot eyes. She had managed to escape only by pretending to faint, allowing her small size to work in her favor as she slipped away in the confusion. But she knew he wouldn't forget, and she knew he wouldn't forgive. "I don't know what you mean, sir," Harriet replied, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. Blackwood's grip tightened, and she felt her shoulder blade grind against his palm. "Oh, I think you do. See, I don't like being made a fool of, especially not by something like you. Tonight, after the work is done, you're going to make it up to me. And this time, there won't be anywhere for you to run." He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling forward, her small frame struggling to maintain balance. Around them, the plantation continued its daily rhythm of oppression. The crack of whips, the shuffle of bare feet on dirt paths, the low murmur of voices speaking in codes that only the enslaved could understand. As Harriet made her way toward the cotton fields, her mind raced with possibilities. She had spent years observing, learning, waiting for the right moment to strike back against the system that had stolen her humanity. Tonight, she realized, that moment might finally arrive. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and with it, the temperature rose to nearly unbearable levels. Harriet worked alongside the other slaves, her small hands moving with practiced efficiency as she picked cotton bolls and dropped them into the heavy sack tied around her waist. Despite her size, she had developed techniques that allowed her to keep pace with workers twice her height, using her low center of gravity and nimble fingers to her advantage. But even as her body went through the motions of labor, her mind was elsewhere, calculating distances, memorizing patrol patterns, and planning for what might be her only chance at justice or revenge. The slave quarters of Magnolia Grove Plantation consisted of a row of ramshackle wooden cabins that housed nearly 200 souls in conditions that would shame a livestock barn. As darkness fell over the Mississippi countryside, oil lamps flickered to life in the small windows, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. Harriet sat on the edge of her narrow cot, sharing the cramped space with 3 other women. Sarah, a field hand whose back bore the permanent scars of countless whippings. Mary, an elderly woman who had been born into slavery and had watched 3 generations of her family sold away. And Ruth, barely 16, and pregnant with a child whose father could have been any of a dozen white men on the plantation. "You need to be careful tonight, child," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of exhausted slaves settling in for a few precious hours of rest. "I seen the way Blackwood been looking at you. That man got the devil in him, and he ain't gonna stop until he gets what he wants." Harriet's fingers traced the outline of the knife hidden beneath her thin mattress. She had spent the afternoon sharpening it further, using a piece of broken glass to hone the edge, until it could slice through rope with a single stroke. "I know, Mary, but I ain't gonna run from him no more." Sarah looked up from where she was tending to a fresh wound on her arm, the result of an accident with Blackwood's whip earlier that day. "Running might be the smart thing to do, Harriet. That man killed a slave last year for looking at him wrong. Claimed the boy was trying to escape, but we all know the truth." "The truth," Harriet repeated, her voice carrying a bitter edge. "The truth is that we've been living like animals for so long, we forgot we're human beings. The truth is that every day we don't fight back, we die a little more inside." Ruth shifted uncomfortably on her cot, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Fighting back just gets you killed, Harriet. Or worse, sold downriver to one of them sugar plantations in Louisiana. At least here, we know what kind of hell we're living in." But Harriet shook her head, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight like polished obsidian. "There's worse things than dying, Ruth. Living on your knees is one of them." Outside, the night sounds of the plantation created a symphony of oppression. The distant howl of bloodhounds trained to track runaway slaves, the creak of rope hanging from the old hanging tree, and the occasional crack of a whip as the night patrol made their rounds. But beneath these sounds, if one listened carefully, there were other noises. Whispered conversations, muffled sobs, and the quiet prayers of people who had been stripped of everything except their faith. As the hours passed, the slave quarters gradually fell silent. One by one, the oil lamps were extinguished, leaving only the pale moonlight to illuminate the rows of cabins. Harriet lay still on her cot, listening to the breathing patterns of her roommates, waiting for the deep, steady rhythm that indicated true sleep. When she was certain the others were unconscious, Harriet carefully retrieved the knife from its hiding place and slipped it into the folds of her dress. She had spent weeks planning this moment, studying Blackwood's habits, learning his routines, and identifying the perfect location for what she had to do. The overseer's cabin stood apart from the slave quarters, a larger structure that reflected his position in the plantation hierarchy. It was close enough to the main house to demonstrate his importance, but far enough away to provide privacy for his more unsavory activities. Harriet had observed that Blackwood typically spent his evenings drinking alone on his front porch, a bottle of whiskey his only companion as he plotted new ways to torment the slaves under his control. Moving with the silence of a shadow, Harriet slipped out of her cabin and began making her way across the plantation grounds. Her small size, which had been a source of mockery and abuse for so many years, now became her greatest asset. She could move through spaces that would be impossible for a full-grown adult, and her light footsteps made no sound on the packed earth paths. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in stark silver light that created deep pools of shadow between the buildings. Harriet used these shadows like a cloak, moving from one patch of darkness to another with the patience of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. As she approached Blackwood's cabin, she could hear the familiar sound of his drunken muttering. The overseer sat slumped in a wooden chair on his porch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in one massive hand. His head lolled back against the chair, and for a moment Harriet thought he might have passed out completely. But then his eyes snapped open, focusing on her with the predatory intensity of a wolf spotting a wounded deer. "Well, well," Blackwood slurred, his voice thick with alcohol and malice. "Look what we got here, little Harriet, coming to visit me in the middle of the night. I knew you'd come around eventually." He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as the whiskey fought with his sense of balance. Even drunk, he was a formidable opponent, nearly twice Harriet's height, and possessing the kind of raw physical strength that came from years of violence and intimidation. "I've been waiting for you, girl," he continued, taking a step toward her. "Been thinking about what I'm gonna do to you ever since you made me look like a fool last night. You're gonna learn what happens to slaves who don't know their place." Harriet stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the knife hidden in her dress. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee back to the relative safety of the slave quarters. But she had made a decision, and she would see it through to the end. "I know my place, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the night air like a whispered prayer. "The question is, do you know yours?" Blackwood's laughter echoed across the plantation grounds like the baying of a rabid dog, harsh and filled with cruel amusement. He took another swig from his whiskey bottle, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as he studied Harriet with the calculating gaze of a man who had broken countless spirits over the years. "You got some mouth on you, little girl," he said, setting the bottle down on the porch railing with deliberate care. "But I'm going to teach you to use it for something more productive." The overseer began descending the wooden steps of his porch, each footfall creating a hollow thump that seemed to reverberate through Harriet's chest. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, mixed with the acrid scent of tobacco and something else, something rotten and corrupt that seemed to emanate from his very soul. "You know what your problem is," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man delivering a sermon. "You think because you're different, because you're small, that the rules don't apply to you. But every slave on this plantation belongs to Master Whitmore, and every slave answers to me. That includes you, freak." Harriet's fingers tightened around the handle of her knife, feeling the rough wood grain against her palm. She had spent countless hours practicing with the blade, learning to compensate for her size with precision and speed. Tonight, all of that preparation would be put to the ultimate test. "I ain't never belonged to nobody," she replied, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "And I ain't never gonna belong to nobody. Especially not to a man who gets his pleasure from hurting people who can't fight back." Blackwood's expression darkened, and his hand moved instinctively to the whip at his belt. "Can't fight back? Girl, you about to learn just how wrong you are about that." He lunged forward with surprising speed for a man his size, his massive hands reaching for Harriet's throat. But she had anticipated this move, had planned for it during the long hours she spent observing his behavior. As his fingers closed around empty air, Harriet dropped to the ground and rolled between his legs, her small stature allowing her to move through a space that would have been impossible for anyone else. "What the hell?" Blackwood spun around, confusion and rage warring on his features as he tried to locate his target in the moonlit darkness. Harriet was already moving, her knife sliding free from its hiding place with a whisper of steel against fabric. She had one chance, one moment when surprise would be on her side. After that, Blackwood's superior size and strength would make victory impossible. The blade found its mark just above Blackwood's left ankle, slicing through the thick tendon with surgical precision. The overseer's scream of pain and shock shattered the night silence, echoing across the plantation like the cry of a wounded animal. He collapsed to one knee, his left leg no longer able to support his weight. "You little bitch!" he roared, reaching for her with hands that could crush her skull like an eggshell. "I'm gonna kill you for this!" But Harriet was already moving again, dancing away from his grasping fingers with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to survive by being faster and smarter than her enemies. The knife flashed again in the moonlight, this time finding the tendon above his right ankle. Blackwood's second scream was even louder than the first, a sound of pure agony that seemed to tear itself from the depths of his soul. The overseer collapsed completely now, both legs useless beneath him. Blood pooled around his ankles, dark and thick in the pale light. He tried to crawl toward his cabin, perhaps hoping to reach the shotgun he kept beside his bed, but his movements were clumsy and desperate. "Please," he gasped, his voice reduced to a pathetic whimper. "Please, I won't tell nobody. I'll say it was an accident. Just help me." Harriet stood over him, the bloody knife still clutched in her small hand. For a moment she felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. But then she remembered all the slaves who had begged him for mercy over the years, all the pleas that had fallen on deaf ears, all the suffering he had inflicted without a moment's hesitation. "Help you?" she repeated, her voice carrying a coldness that seemed to freeze the very air around them. "The way you helped Sarah when you whipped her for dropping a cotton sack. The way you helped old Thomas when you worked him to death in the fields. The way you were going to help me tonight." Blackwood's eyes widened as he realized that his victim had become his judge, jury, and executioner. "You can't do this," he whispered. "You're just a slave. You're nothing." "Maybe," Harriet agreed, kneeling down beside him so that her face was level with his. "But right now, I'm the one with the knife, and you're the one bleeding in the dirt. So tell me, Mr. Blackwood, who's nothing now?" She reached into his pocket and retrieved a length of rope that he typically used to bind runaway slaves. With practiced efficiency, she began fashioning a crude tourniquet around each of his ankles, not to save his life, but to ensure that he wouldn't bleed to death before she was finished with him. What are you doing?" Blackwood asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harriet looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight like chips of obsidian. "I'm giving you a choice, Mr. Blackwood, the same kind of choice you gave all of us every day. You can crawl back to your cabin on your belly like the snake you are, or you can try to walk on those legs I just cut. Either way, you're gonna know what it feels like to be helpless." The overseer stared at her in horror, finally understanding the full scope of what she had done. His legs were ruined, the tendons severed beyond any hope of proper healing. Even if he survived this night, he would never walk normally again. The man who had terrorized an entire plantation with his physical dominance had been reduced to a cripple by someone he had considered beneath his notice. "You're insane," he breathed. "They'll hang you for this. They'll make an example of you that every slave in Mississippi will remember." Harriet smiled, and there was something in that expression that was far more terrifying than any scream of rage. "Maybe they will," she said quietly, "but you'll never see it happen. Because tonight, you're gonna learn what it means to crawl." The night air carried the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of fear sweat as Blackwood lay writhing in the dirt outside his cabin. His massive frame, which had once been a symbol of absolute authority over the plantation's enslaved population, now seemed pathetic and broken in the pale moonlight. The tourniquets Harriet had fashioned around his ankles had slowed the bleeding, but dark stains continued to spread across the packed earth beneath him. "Get up," Harriet commanded, her voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible coming from someone barely 3 feet tall. The knife in her hand caught the moonlight, its blade still slick with the overseer's blood. Blackwood's eyes darted between Harriet's face and the weapon she held, searching for any sign of mercy or hesitation. He found none. "I can't," he gasped, his voice hoarse from screaming. "You cut my tendons. I can't feel my feet." "I didn't ask if you could feel them," Harriet replied, her tone as cold as winter steel. "I told you to get up. You spent years telling slaves to work through pain, to push past their limits, to ignore their suffering for the good of the plantation. Now it's your turn." The overseer attempted to rise, using his massive arms to push himself up from the ground. But without the support of his legs, he immediately collapsed back down, his face contorting in agony as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his severed tendons. "This is impossible," he wheezed. "You've crippled me. I need a doctor." Harriet circled around him slowly, like a predator studying wounded prey. "Impossible? That's what you told Jenny when she begged you to let her rest after working 18 hours straight in the cotton fields. That's what you told Marcus when he asked for medicine for his sick child. Impossible was your favorite word, Mr. Blackwood. Now you get to live it." She gestured toward his cabin with the tip of her knife. "Your front door is maybe 20 feet away. If you can make it there, crawling on your belly like the snake you are, I'll let you live to see morning. If you can't..." She let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but perfectly clear. Blackwood looked at the distance between himself and his cabin door, and for the first time in his adult life, 20 feet seemed like an impossible journey. But the alternative, dying in the dirt like a wounded animal, was even worse. With a grunt of effort and pain, he began to drag himself forward using only his arms. The progress was agonizingly slow. Each movement sent fresh jolts of agony through his ruined legs, and the rough ground scraped against his chest and belly, tearing his shirt and leaving bloody scratches on his skin. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with tears of pain and humiliation that he couldn't control. "That's it," Harriet encouraged, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Just like you taught us, 1 foot in front of the other." "Oh wait, you don't have feet anymore, do you?" As Blackwood struggled across the ground, Harriet began to speak, her voice carrying across the night air like a eulogy for the dead. "You want to know something, Mr. Blackwood? I've been watching you for years, studying you, learning your habits, your weaknesses, your fears. You think you're so strong, so powerful, but you're just a coward who gets his strength from hurting people weaker than yourself." The overseer paused in his crawling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why are you doing this?" Harriet knelt down beside him, her small face inches from his. "Because someone had to. Because every slave on this plantation has dreamed of this moment, but they were too scared or too broken to act. Because you represent everything evil about this place, and evil needs to be punished." She stood up and resumed her slow circle around his struggling form. "But mostly, I'm doing this because I can. Because tonight, for the first time in my life, I have the power, and you don't. How does it feel, Mr. Blackwood? How does it feel to be helpless?" Blackwood had managed to crawl perhaps 5 feet, leaving a trail of blood and dirt behind him. His arms were already beginning to shake with exhaustion, and he could feel his strength ebbing away with each passing moment. The whiskey that had given him courage earlier now worked against him, making his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. "I'm sorry," he gasped, the words torn from his throat like pieces of his soul. "I'm sorry for everything I'd done. Please just let me live." Harriet's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Sorry? You're sorry now? Where was that sorry when you sold little Timothy away from his mother? Where was that sorry when you raped Sarah behind the smokehouse? Where was that sorry when you beat old Moses to death for stealing a piece of bread? The overseer's arms gave out, and he collapsed face first into the dirt. For a moment, Harriet thought he might have died, but then she saw the slight rise and fall of his massive back as he struggled to breathe. "Get up," she commanded again. "You're not even halfway there." With what seemed like superhuman effort, Blackwood pushed himself up again and resumed his agonizing journey. His fingernails were torn and bleeding from clawing at the hard-packed earth, and his arms trembled with the effort of supporting his weight. But he continued forward, driven by a desperate will to survive that overrode his pain and humiliation. As he crawled, other slaves began to emerge from their cabins, drawn by the sounds of his screams and Harriet's voice. They stood in the shadows at the edges of the clearing, afraid to come closer, but unable to look away from the impossible sight before them. Their tormentor, the man who had held absolute power over their lives, reduced to crawling through the dirt like a wounded animal. Sarah was among them, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock and disbelief. Mary stood beside her, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched justice finally being served. Ruth clutched her pregnant belly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Don't just stand there," Harriet called out to them, her voice carrying clearly across the night air. "Come closer. See what your overseer really is when you strip away his whip and his authority. See how small he becomes when he can't hurt anyone anymore." Slowly, hesitantly, the slaves began to move closer. They formed a loose circle around the crawling overseer, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction, fear, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. Blackwood looked up at the faces surrounding him, seeing for the first time the full extent of the hatred and resentment he had inspired over the years. These people, whom he had considered less than human, were now his judges and witnesses. Their eyes held no mercy, no sympathy, only the cold satisfaction of seeing justice finally served. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "don't let her do this to me." But no one moved to help him, no one spoke in his defense. They simply watched as he continued his humiliating journey toward his cabin door, each painful inch a testament to the cruelty he had inflicted on others. The circle of slaves grew larger as word spread through the quarters like wildfire. Men, women, and children emerged from their cabins, moving like ghosts in the moonlight, to witness something that would have been unthinkable just hours before. The most feared man on Magnolia Grove plantation was crawling through the dirt, his power stripped away by someone they had all dismissed as harmless. Blackwood had managed to cover perhaps 10 feet now, his progress marked by a trail of blood and torn earth. His breathing had become labored, each gasp a struggle against the pain that racked his massive frame. The whiskey that had once given him courage now made his head spin and his vision blur, adding to his disorientation and helplessness. "Look at him," whispered Samuel, an elderly field hand whose back bore the scars of countless whippings. "Look how small he is now." "Hush," warned his wife Martha, glancing nervously toward the main house. Master Whitmore might hear, but Harriet shook her head, her dark eyes never leaving Blackwood's struggling form. "Master Whitmore is dead drunk in his study, just like every night. And even if he wasn't, what's he gonna do? Punish us for watching his overseer crawl through the dirt like a snake?" The truth of her words settled over the gathered slaves like a revelation. For the first time in their lives, they were witnessing something that gave them power over their oppressor, and the intoxicating feeling of that reversal was almost overwhelming. Young Benjamin, barely 14 years old, stepped closer to the crawling overseer. "This the man who sold my sister downriver," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "This the man who said she was getting too uppity, needed to be taught a lesson. And this the man who worked my boy to death in the fields," added Rebecca, her weathered hands clenched into fists. "Said he was lazy, said he needed to learn the value of hard work. My boy was only 12 years old. One by one, the slaves began to speak, their voices creating a litany of suffering and injustice that had been building for years. Each story was a testament to Blackwood's cruelty, each memory a weight that had been carried in silence until this moment. Blackwood tried to block out their voices, focusing all his energy on the seemingly impossible task of reaching his cabin door. But their words penetrated his consciousness like knives, each accusation a reminder of the pain he had inflicted without thought or remorse. "I remember when you made us work through that hurricane," called out Thomas, a man whose left arm hung useless at his side from an old injury. "Said the cotton was more important than our lives. 3 people died that day because you wouldn't let us take shelter." "And what about when you burned down the school we built in secret?" added Grace, a woman who had taught herself to read despite the laws forbidding slave literacy. "Said we didn't need to know nothing but how to pick cotton and say, 'Yes, sir.'" The accusations continued to pour forth, years of suppressed anger and resentment finally finding voice. Blackwood's crawling became more erratic as the weight of his crimes pressed down upon him like a physical force. He had never considered the cumulative effect of his actions, never thought about the lives he had destroyed or the families he had torn apart. Harriet watched it all with the satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated a perfect symphony of justice. She had not only physically crippled her tormentor, but had also created a moment where his victims could finally speak their truth without fear of retribution. 15 feet to go, she announced, her voice cutting through the chorus of accusations. "You're making good progress, Mr. Blackwood, almost like you were born to crawl." The overseer's arms were shaking violently now, barely able to support his weight. His fingernails were torn and bloody, and his shirt hung in tatters from his struggles against the rough ground. But he continued forward, driven by a desperate will to survive that overrode his pain and humiliation. As he crawled, something began to change in the atmosphere around the gathered slaves. The initial shock and fear were giving way to something else, a sense of empowerment that they had never experienced before. For the first time in their lives, they were seeing their oppressor brought low, and the psychological impact was profound. "We should help him," suggested Moses, a young man whose natural compassion had somehow survived years of brutality. But Sarah shook her head firmly. "Help him? The way he helped us when we begged for mercy? The way he helped when we were sick or injured or dying? No, let him crawl. Let him feel what it's like to be powerless." The debate that followed was conducted in whispers, but the passion behind the words was unmistakable. Some slaves argued for mercy, their Christian faith compelling them to forgive even their worst enemy. Others demanded justice, their anger finally finding an outlet after years of suppression. "This ain't about mercy," Harriet said, her voice rising above the whispered arguments. "This is about truth. This is about showing the world what kind of man Jeremiah Blackwood really is when you strip away his whip and his authority. This is about proving that we ain't the animals he said we were. He is." Blackwood had managed to crawl another few feet, but his progress was slowing dramatically. His massive frame, which had once been a source of intimidation and power, now worked against him as he struggled to drag his dead weight across the unforgiving ground. "I can't," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "I can't go any further." "You can't," Harriet repeated, her tone mocking. "That's what little Sarah said when you made her work in the fields the day after she gave birth. That's what old Peter said when you forced him to carry cotton bales that weighed more than he did. But you didn't listen then, did you?" She knelt down beside him, her small face inches from his. "You know what the difference is between you and us, Mr. Blackwood? When we said we couldn't, you made us anyway. When you say you can't, I'm going to make you anyway, because that's what justice looks like." The overseer's eyes filled with tears of pain and desperation. "Please," he whispered, "I'll do anything. I'll change. I'll treat everyone better. Just please, let this end." Harriet studied his face for a long moment. searching for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. What she saw instead was the same calculating look he had always worn, the expression of a man who would say anything to save himself and return to his old ways the moment he felt safe. "You know what, Mr. Blackwood," she said finally, "I believe you would change, for a while, until you healed up enough to hold a whip again, until you forgot what it felt like to be helpless. Then you'd go right back to being the monster you've always been." She stood up and stepped back, gesturing toward his cabin door. 5 more feet. That's all you got left. 5 feet between you and safety. But those 5 feet are gonna feel like 5 miles, because now you know what it's like to be us. Dawn was still hours away, but the eastern horizon showed the faintest hint of gray as Blackwood made his final desperate push toward his cabin door. His massive frame had been reduced to a broken, bleeding wreck, his once powerful arms now trembling with exhaustion as they struggled to support his weight. The trail of blood and torn earth behind him told the story of his agonizing journey, each inch a testament to the cruelty he had inflicted on others. The gathered slaves had grown silent now, their initial excitement giving way to a more complex mixture of emotions. Some watched with grim satisfaction, while others seemed troubled by the brutality they were witnessing, but none moved to help him, and none spoke in his defense. Harriet stood at the edge of the circle, her small frame silhouetted against the night sky like an avenging angel. The knife in her hand had long since been cleaned and returned to its hiding place, but the memory of what she had done would remain with everyone present for the rest of their lives. 3 feet, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the night air. "You're almost there, Mr. Blackwood, almost to your sanctuary. But tell me, what do you think is going to happen when you reach that door?" Blackwood didn't answer, focusing all his remaining energy on the seemingly impossible task before him. His fingernails scraped against the wooden steps of his porch, leaving bloody scratches in the weathered planks. With a superhuman effort born of desperation, he managed to haul himself up onto the first step. "You think you're gonna crawl inside and everything's gonna go back to the way it was?" Harriet continued, her voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than any scream of rage. "You think you're gonna heal up and come back stronger than ever? You think this is just gonna be a bad dream you can forget about?" The overseer collapsed on the porch steps, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His shirt was completely torn now, hanging in bloody tatters from his massive frame. Sweat and tears streamed down his face, mixing with the dirt and blood that covered his features. "I made it," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "I made it to the door." Harriet smiled, and there was something in that expression that chilled the blood of everyone watching. "Yes, you did. Congratulations, Mr. Blackwood. You crawled 20 feet through the dirt like the snake you are, but now comes the hard part." She gestured toward the cabin door, which stood closed and locked above him. "See, you made it to your porch, but you ain't made it inside yet. And that door might as well be on the moon for all the good it's gonna do you now." The truth of her words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. The door handle was positioned for someone of normal height, completely out of reach for a man who could no longer stand. Even if he managed to reach it, he lacked the strength to pull himself upright enough to turn the handle and push the door open. "No," he whispered, his voice filled with dawning horror. "No, this can't be happening." "Oh, but it is," Harriet replied, her tone almost cheerful. "See, this is what we call poetic justice. You spent years making us feel small, making us feel powerless, making us crawl. Now you get to know what that feels like for the rest of your life." She turned to address the gathered slaves, her voice rising to carry across the night air. "Look at him, all of you. Look at the man who held absolute power over your lives. Look at how small he is now. Look at how helpless he is when he can't hurt anyone anymore." The slaves stared at the broken figure on the porch steps, and something fundamental shifted in their understanding of the world. The man who had seemed larger than life, who had appeared to possess unlimited power over their existence, was revealed to be nothing more than a bully whose strength came from the suffering of others. "What happens now?" asked Samuel, his voice barely above a whisper. Harriet considered the question for a long moment. Now we go back to our cabins and get what sleep we can before the work bell rings. Tomorrow, Master Whitmore is going to find his overseer crippled and broken, and he's going to want answers. Some of you might be tempted to tell him what really happened." She paused, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the assembled slaves. "But I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember what it felt like to see justice served. And I want you to remember that if one small woman can bring down the most feared man on this plantation, then maybe we ain't as powerless as we thought." The implications of her words settled over the group like a revelation. For the first time in their lives, they had witnessed one of their own successfully fighting back against their oppressors. The psychological impact was profound, planting seeds of resistance that would grow in the days and weeks to come. "They'll hang you for this," warned Martha, her voice filled with concern for the young woman who had become an unlikely hero. Harriet nodded calmly. "Maybe they will, but I ain't gonna run, and I ain't gonna hide. What I did tonight, I did for all of us. And if they want to make an example of me, then let them. Sometimes the example teaches a different lesson than the one they intended." Blackwood had managed to pull himself up against his cabin door, his back pressed against the wooden planks as he struggled to reach the handle above his head. But his ruined legs couldn't support his weight, and his arms lacked the strength to lift his massive frame high enough to reach his goal. "Help me!" he pleaded, his voice directed at the slaves who surrounded his porch. "Please, I'm begging you. Help me get inside." The request hung in the air like a challenge, testing the resolve of people who had been conditioned to obey his every command. For a moment, some of them seemed to waver, their ingrained habits of submission warring with their newfound sense of empowerment. But then Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Help you? The way you helped me when I begged you not to sell my children? The way you helped when I asked for medicine for my sick baby? No, Mr. Blackwood. You made your choice a long time ago. Now you get to live with the consequences." One by one, the other slaves began to turn away, returning to their cabins as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. They left Blackwood alone on his porch, broken and helpless, a living testament to the price of cruelty and the power of justice. As the last of the slaves disappeared into the darkness, Harriet remained standing in the clearing, her small figure silhouetted against the lightening sky. She looked up at Blackwood one final time, her dark eyes reflecting the first rays of the rising sun. "Goodbye, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. "I hope you enjoy your new perspective on life. I hope you remember this feeling every time you think about the pain you caused others. And I hope you understand that this is what justice looks like when it finally comes home to roost." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the broken overseer alone with his pain and his memories. Behind her, the plantation began to stir with the sounds of another day beginning, but everything had changed. The balance of power had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across Magnolia Grove Plantation as the work bell rang out across the grounds, its harsh clang echoing off the slave quarters and the main house alike. But this morning was different from all the others that had come before it. The slaves emerged from their cabins with a new energy, a subtle change in their posture and bearing that spoke of something fundamental having shifted in the night. Harriet stood among them, her small frame no longer seeming diminished by the towering figures around her. If anything, she appeared to have grown in stature, her dark eyes holding a quiet confidence that commanded respect from everyone who looked upon her. The knife was once again hidden in the folds of her dress, but its presence was no longer a secret weapon. It had become a symbol of resistance that would inspire others long after this day had passed. Master Edmund Whitmore, emerged from the main house at his usual time, his white linen suit immaculate despite the early hour. But as he surveyed his property, he immediately noticed that something was amiss. The slaves were assembled in the main courtyard as always, but there was no sign of Jeremiah Blackwood, the overseer who had maintained order through fear and brutality for the past 5 years. "Where is Blackwood?" Whitmore demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. The slaves exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The silence stretched on for long moments, broken only by the distant sound of birds singing in the oak trees and the gentle rustle of wind through the cotton fields. Finally, Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "He's on his porch, Master Whitmore, but he ain't quite himself this morning." Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he studied the faces of his slaves, searching for any sign of deception or rebellion. What he saw instead was something far more troubling, a quiet confidence that he had never witnessed before, a sense of solidarity that spoke of shared secrets and common purpose. "What do you mean, he's not himself?" Whitmore asked, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Maybe you should go see for yourself, sir," suggested Samuel, his tone respectful, but somehow lacking the usual fear that characterized interactions between slaves and their master. Whitmore strode across the plantation grounds toward Blackwood's cabin, his polished boots clicking against the packed earth with increasing urgency. As he approached the overseer's porch, he could hear the sound of labored breathing and what might have been quiet sobbing. The sight that greeted him defied all comprehension. Jeremiah Blackwood, the man who had been the physical embodiment of the plantation's authority, sat slumped against his cabin door like a broken doll. His legs were twisted at unnatural angles, dark stains of dried blood marking the crude tourniquets that had been tied around his ankles. His massive frame, which had once inspired fear in every slave on the plantation, now seemed pathetic and diminished. "My God," Whitmore breathed, his face pale with shock. "What happened to you?" Blackwood looked up with eyes that held a mixture of pain, humiliation, and something that might have been madness. "She did this to me," he whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of screaming and pleading. "That little freak, she cut my tendons. She made me crawl." "Who?" Whitmore demanded, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Harriet," Blackwood replied, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "Harriet Green. She's been planning this, watching me, waiting for her chance, and when she got it—" He gestured helplessly at his ruined legs. Whitmore's face flushed red with rage as the implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. A slave, a female slave no less, and one afflicted with dwarfism, had successfully attacked and crippled his overseer. The very foundation of the plantation's social order had been shattered by someone he had considered beneath notice. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I don't know," Blackwood admitted. "She just walked away, left me here to die." Whitmore turned and strode back toward the main courtyard, his mind racing with the implications of what had occurred. This was not simply an act of violence, it was an act of rebellion that threatened the very structure of the plantation system. If word of this spread to other plantations, if other slaves began to believe that they could successfully fight back against their oppressors, the consequences could be catastrophic. The slaves were still assembled in the courtyard when he returned, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes alert and watchful. Whitmore scanned their ranks until his gaze fell upon Harriet, who stood calmly among the others as if nothing had happened. "Harriet Green," he called out, his voice carrying across the morning air like the crack of a whip. "Step forward." Harriet moved through the crowd of slaves with unhurried steps, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite her size. She stopped directly in front of Whitmore, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching or looking away. "You know why I've called you forward," Whitmore said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Yes, sir," Harriet replied calmly. "I expect I do. Do you deny what you've done?" Harriet considered the question for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "No, sir, I don't deny it. I cut Jeremiah Blackwood's tendons and made him crawl to his cabin like the snake he is. And given the chance, I'd do it again." A collective gasp rose from the assembled slaves, not because they were shocked by her confession, but because of the quiet dignity with which she delivered it. There was no defiance in her voice, no anger or hatred, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Whitmore stared at her in disbelief. In his experience, slaves who committed acts of violence against their overseers typically begged for mercy, claimed innocence, or tried to shift blame to others. But Harriet stood before him with the bearing of someone who had acted with purpose and accepted the consequences of her actions. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you comprehend the magnitude of your crime?" "I understand that I stopped a man from hurting people who couldn't defend themselves," Harriet replied. "I understand that I gave him a taste of the helplessness he's been serving to others for years. And I understand that sometimes justice has to be taken rather than waited for." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Whitmore felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach. This was not the response of a broken slave seeking forgiveness. This was the declaration of someone who had found their power and refused to surrender it. "You will hang for this," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I will see you strung up from the old oak tree as an example to every slave in Mississippi. Your death will serve as a reminder of what happens to those who forget their place." Harriet nodded calmly, as if she had expected nothing less. "Maybe so, Master Whitmore, but my death won't change what happened last night. It won't give Jeremiah Blackwood his legs back, and it won't erase the memory of what these people saw, that even the most powerful man on this plantation could be brought low by someone he considered beneath his notice." She gestured toward the assembled slaves, her voice rising slightly. "They saw justice served, Master Whitmore. They saw that we ain't as powerless as you want us to believe. And that's something you can't take back, no matter how many examples you make." The truth of her words settled over the plantation like a shroud, and Whitmore realized that he was facing something far more dangerous than a simple act of violence. Harriet Green had not just attacked his overseer, she had attacked the very idea that slaves were helpless victims who could be abused without consequence. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its light over Magnolia Grove Plantation, everyone present understood that this day marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The balance of power had shifted, and though Harriet Green might pay the ultimate price for her actions, the seeds of resistance she had planted would continue to grow long after she was gone. The slaves began to disperse to their assigned tasks, but there was something different in their movements now, a subtle change in posture, a quiet confidence that spoke of shared secrets and newfound hope. They had witnessed the impossible. One of their own had successfully fought back against their oppressor and lived to tell the tale. And in the years that would follow, when the winds of change began to blow across the American South, many would remember this morning as the moment when they first understood that freedom was not something to be granted by others, but something to be seized by those brave enough to reach for it. Harriet Green had shown them the way, and though her own journey would end at the hangman's noose, her legacy would live on in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed her courage. She had proven that even the smallest among them could stand tall in the face of injustice, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against oppression was the simple refusal to remain silent in the face of evil. The story of the dwarf slave who brought down the overseer would be whispered in slave quarters across the South, growing in the telling until it became legend. And though the institution of slavery would endure for decades more, The crack that Harriet Green had opened in its foundation would continue to widen until the entire system finally crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. In the end, justice had been served, not through the courts or the law, but through the courage of one small woman who refused to accept that her size determined her worth or her power. She had shown the world that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict suffering on others, but from the willingness to stand up for what is right, regardless of the cost.